The man known to history as Rollo of Normandy was born in the mid-9th century, potentially in the year 860 AD. He was a Viking from the region of Scandinavia and later the founder and first ruler of Normandy. Rollo has also been called Rolf, Ru, Roland in French, and Hrafr in Old Norse. His father was possibly Rognvald Eysteinsson, the founding Jarl or Earl of Møre, a county at the northern tip of western Norway. Rognvald, known as Rognvald the Wise and Rognvald the Powerful, was a close relative and ally of King Harald Fairhair, the earliest known king of Norway. Rognvald makes a brief appearance in the Norse sagas, which are prose stories and histories from Iceland and Scandinavia that often told of Viking voyages, migrations, and family feuds. But little accurate information is known about Rognvald's life, especially as the sagas were prone to exaggeration, contradiction, and outright myth-making. It was said that Rognvald played a role in the founding of the Norse earldom of Orkney and led raids on towns on the Scottish mainland and Ireland from there. But, as with the information on the rest of his life, there is only very limited evidence to support this claim. It should also be noted that Jarl Rognvald Eysteinsson may not have even been Rollo's father. Alternative written documents by French chroniclers Dudu Saint-Quentin and monk Richer of Rheims claimed that Rollo's father was actually named Ketil and was possibly Ketil Flatnose, King of the Isles, a Norse realm in the Western Isles of Scotland. This claim is based on the identification of Rollo's brother Gurim, who was given the patronymic Grim after Ketil Flatnose's father Bjorn Grimson. Equally, both Rollo and Ketil had ancestors from Møre in western Norway. However, these accounts were written a century after Rollo had lived, and, in the case of Dudo, under the commission of Rollo's grandson, Richard I of Normandy. Rollo's mother was a Scandinavian noblewoman named Hildur Hrolfsdottir, but this parental claim relies on a single piece of evidence from the family history commissioned by Richard I of Normandy. However, Rollo's Norse name, Rolfr, could have potentially been a name passed down through the maternal side of his family. According to the sagas, the largest pieces of written evidence available to us, Hildur was the daughter of Rolf Nefje or Hrolfr Nevja, Jarl of Trondheim in Norway. In the Orkneyinga saga, the daughter of Rolf Nefje is called Ragnhild, although in other sagas she is Hildur. In the sagas, a dispute is noted between King Harald Fairhair of Norway and Rollo's family. During this conflict, Rollo's disputed father, likely Jarl Rognvald Eysteinsson, is killed, along with his brother Gurim. Rollo is spared execution and forced into exile after his mother, Hildur, appealed for clemency for her son. At this time, Hildur composed a skaldic stanza, a type of medieval Scandinavian poetry, which is one of few examples composed by a woman that survived to the present. It is also why we, today, know her name. It was said that after his mother had failed to win him a full pardon, Rollo was forced to leave Norway, or perhaps Denmark, as the historic record is also not clear on where he came from. He then wandered the North Sea in exile, staying perhaps in Orkney. As with Rollo's parentage, there is little concrete information about much of his early life. The chroniclers who wrote about him lived many years after his death, and their records were often written to bolster the Norman dynasty he founded, rather than to record things as they actually happened. The question of where in Scandinavia Rollo was from is a good example of the contradictions historians face when they try to understand him. Chronicler Dudo Saint-Quentin and the main source for later chroniclers, William of Jumièges, after 1066, as well as Orderic Vitalis in the early 12th century, all recorded that Rollo was from Denmark, though later chroniclers, such as Geoffrey Malaterra, an 11th century Benedictine monk and historian, and 12th century English historian William of Malmesbury, stated that he was from Norway. To complicate matters further, Icelandic historian Snorre Sturluson stated that Rollo was Hrolf the Walker, a man made into myth in the 13th century Icelandic Helmskringla sagas about Swedish and Norwegian kings, as well as in the Ogninga saga. Hrolf the Walker was said to be from late 9th century Moray in Norway, and was born to Jarl Ragnvald Eysteinsson and noblewoman Hildur Hrolfsdottir, as Rollo was. Hrolf the Walker was given his epithet because he was apparently so big that no horse could carry him, so he spent his time walking everywhere. But the claims that Rollo was Hrolf the Walker were made well after Rollo's lifetime, and even 3 centuries after the history commissioned by his own grandson. A genetic investigation in 2016 looked at the remains of Rollo's grandson, Richard the Fearless, and his great-grandson, Richard the Good, in an attempt to identify Rollo's origins. But the remains in both graves were found to predate Rollo and were not related to him. The Norwegian archaeologists that undertook the investigation suggested that the 2 bodies they found in the tomb had been moved there to replace those of Richard I and Richard II to protect them from grave robbers. This investigation, like the sagas and chronicles before it, failed to identify Rollo's origins. With little reliable information available, the identity of Rollo's parents, as well as his birth date and birthplace, remain somewhat uncertain. One of the difficulties in identifying his home country is that place names were used interchangeably at the time. For example, Viking, Northmen, Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians would have all been used to refer to the general region of Scandinavia and the various people that lived there. The distinctions and national borders between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden that exist today did not exist in the same way at the time when Rollo lived. If we presume, however, that Rollo was the son of Ragnvald Eysteinsson, then he would have been one of 6 brothers. His elder brothers, Halad, Einar, and Hrolug, were born out of wedlock to concubines and were already grown up by the time that the younger legitimate sons were born. The younger sons were Ivar, Hrolfr, thought to be Rollo, and Thorir the Silent. It is the Norse sagas that identify Hrolfr as Rollo, though these sagas are slightly problematic sources as they were written well after Rollo's death, and generally favoured the sensational over the factual. The Norse sagas often sought to draw connections between famous people and bolster dubious familial claims, rather than note genuine family relations and histories. However, in the case of Rollo, Scottish and Irish accounts from the time do support the claim that Rollo was Hrolfr, son of Ragnvald Eysteinsson. It is known that Rollo followed the Old Norse religion, known to its Christian neighbours as Norse paganism. The Old Norse religion was polytheistic. The most famous of its many gods were Odin and Thor, but 2 sets of gods and goddesses existed, the Aesir and the Vanir, who fought against each other in an ancient battle before agreeing that they were equally powerful. The world of the Old Norse religion also contained other mythological races, including dwarves, giants, elves, and spirits of nature, which all existed around the world tree, the Yggdrasil. As the Old Norse religion was part of an oral culture rather than a written one, it involved a lot of ritual activity. Kings and chiefs played a key role in the practice of the religion, including leading public acts of sacrifice in cult houses or sacred outdoor spaces like groves and lakes. 2 centuries after Rollo had lived, the Old Norse religion had been replaced by Christianity, though elements of Scandinavian folklore survived. The Viking world into which Rollo was born was one that was expanding. The Vikings of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had traded, raided, and settled throughout parts of Europe between the late 8th century and the late 11th century. They travelled as far apart as the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Middle East, North Africa, and North America. The Vikings had a profound impact on the early medieval history of many of the places they went, including Scandinavia, the British Isles, France, and Kievan Rus, a state which encompassed East Slavic, Norse, and Finnic peoples and covered parts of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. This was the Viking Age. The Vikings were expert sailors and navigators and dominated the waterways of Europe. Their distinctive longships were perfect for river navigation as well as long-distance exploration across the Atlantic. The flexible design of the Viking longships allowed them to be used both for raiding and campaigning and for long-distance trade, exploration, and colonization. Generally speaking, these ships were long and thin with symmetrical ends. They were made with overlapping planks according to the clinker boat-building method which originated in Scandinavia and spread across the North Sea to Britain. Their design often favoured speed over load capacity and were generally built for coastal water sailing rather than open water sailing. But this didn't restrict the Vikings to the waters of the North Sea. They voyaged to distant locations to participate in the trade of exotic goods and to the very edges of the known world. Trade with Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire located around present-day Istanbul and Arabia, proved especially fruitful. Byzantine silverware, garnet from India and Sri Lanka, Islamic coins, and even a gold Buddha statue are just some of the exotic goods found in graves across Scandinavia and Viking Britain. There is also archaeological evidence that the Vikings reached Baghdad, the center of the Islamic Empire and trade hub of the lucrative Silk Road. Silk, that must have made its way to the Near East from China before being carried across Europe by the Vikings, appears in graves across the Viking world. The Vikings regularly plied the Volga River with their own trade goods too: furs, tusks, seal fat for boat sealant, and the slaves they captured from raiding. As an exceptionally mobile people, the Vikings were more cultural and ethnically mixed than we might think. The movement of people and the tendency of Viking men to take foreign and often multiple wives influenced the genetic and historical development of both Scandinavia and the East. Foreign cultural influences, from styles of dress to desirable status goods, highlighted the connections between Scandinavia and the East. Exotic jewelry, carnelian beads from India, and Chinese silks began being worn by Viking noblewomen, and the fashion trickled down to the lower levels of society too. The most culturally mixed places in the Viking world were its trade ports. There were many important trading ports, in particular Birka Island in Sweden. Birka was a melting pot of exotic goods, foreign coins, and peoples from across the world. Viking Birka was Sweden's oldest town and had a population of between 500 and 1,000 people, with over 2,000 graves and many more unmarked ones from this period found in its graveyard. The Viking age of migration, trade, and wealth ushered in the start of real urbanization across Scandinavia. The discovery of goods in Birka from the Middle East emphasizes the vast, lucrative trade networks developed by the Vikings. Eastern textiles, an Allah ring featuring an inscription in Arabic with the word Allah, and dirham coins from Al-Shah, modern-day Tashkent in Uzbekistan, among many other goods, have all been found here. Birka was abandoned around 975 when Sigtuna, a Christian town was founded just 35 kilometers to the northeast of the island city. Other important Viking trading ports included Hedeby, a village in modern-day Denmark on the Jutland Peninsula, and Koppang, meaning marketplace, which was the first market town in Norway near modern Oslo. There were also thriving Viking trading bases outside of Scandinavia, such as Jorvik, modern-day York in England, Starea, Ladoga on the Volkhov River, around 100 miles from modern St. Petersburg, and Novgorod, the old capital of Kievan Rus. The Viking trading network, which spread across the waterways of Europe and beyond, was even vaster than the raiding one for which the Vikings were to be better known. The versatility of the Viking longships made them suited for raiding as well as trading and exploration. The speed, shallow draft, maneuverability, and lightweight design in particular were essential to Viking raiding strategies. The success of Viking raids relied heavily on the element of surprise and on speed. Given that the same ships were used for raiding and trading, especially early in the Viking period, it would have been impossible for the inhabitants to tell if the approaching Vikings were traders or had come with a bloodier purpose. The important element of surprise restricted any possibility for defences to be called, just as with the infamous raid on the religious site of Lindisfarne in Northumbria, northern England, in 793 AD. Vikings had been travelling and trading along the English and Scottish coastline for many years before they turned their minds to the greater profits that raiding offered. The Vikings did not restrict their raiding to wealthy monasteries on the English coast alone. Raids occurred on the coasts, internal waterways, and sea-facing towns of Ireland, England, Scotland, Frankia and the Rhineland, and what was to become the Holy Roman Empire and the eastern territories between the Baltic and Black Seas, including the Rus. Evidence suggests Viking raiding routes even reached Spain, round into the Mediterranean and beyond Europe into the Middle East. In particular, the Frankish city of Rouen and the affluent monasteries along the River Seine were targeted repeatedly. The reputation of the Vikings as fearsome and skilled warriors spread along the trade routes they had developed to Byzantium, now Istanbul. As early as 839, Swedish emissaries are known to have visited Byzantium. Not long after, Scandinavians started to serve the Byzantine Empire as mercenaries in such large numbers that by the late 10th century a new unit, called the Varangian Guard, was formed and traditionally contained a large number of Scandinavians. This offer of employment in the Varangian Guard drew so many Swedish men that a new law had to be passed to limit this loss of manpower. The Västgötalagen law stated that any man staying in Greece, the term used in Scandinavia to refer to the Byzantine Empire, could not inherit. This drain was made worse by the heavy recruitment from two other European courts, the Kievan Rus between 980 and 1060, and England from around 1013 to 1066. The Thingmen, or Assembly Retinue Unit, served under the Kings of England and included a great number of Norwegians and Swedes. They were paid via direct taxation to protect England against other Viking raiders. The Vikings proved to be effective mercenaries across Europe. In the early Viking period, raiding and trading was a seasonal activity and was by no means the only occupation for Viking men, many of whom were farmers and craftsmen. Those that did raid and trade did so in the raiding season, that is, the warmer months of the year when calmer weather would enable the pillaging of the coasts along the North Sea and English Channel and trading across much of Europe and into the Middle East. Then they would return to Scandinavia for the winter months when bad weather made sailing inadvisable. But the seasonal interactions with the coasts of England, Scotland, Ireland and France were to become something much more permanent, as, later in the period, the Vikings chose to settle more permanently in some of the places they raided. The late 9th century, around the time that Rollo was born, saw the rise of the largest Viking settlement outside of Scandinavia, the Danelaw in northern and eastern England. The invasion of the Great Heathen Army, or so English chronicles called the Viking force, into England ended in a peace in which Viking control was solidified in the region which became known as the Danelaw, with its centre in Jorvik, now York. This region experienced increased Scandinavian settlement and a combining of the two cultures and languages, resulting in an Anglo-Norse dialect that is still evident in place names in the north of England today. As the population in Scandinavia increased, Viking warriors increasingly sought to move to the nearby British Isles, where they had once sought glory and treasure, to now take up more peaceful pastimes, such as farming, and settle there permanently. Viking navigators voyaged north from the English coast and began opening up new lands, resulting in settlements in the Shetland, Orkney and Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, and, for a short while, Newfoundland. The Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America when they briefly settled in Newfoundland, which they called Vinland, around the year 1000. Viking settlements were also established along the important waterways of Eastern Europe, including near the Dnieper River, an important trade route which connected Scandinavia, Kievan Rus, and the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as the Volga River, which crossed modern-day Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. In this region, the Viking Rurik dynasty ruled Kievan Rus from 862 to 1598, when they were replaced, after the time of troubles, with the Romanov dynasty in Russia. They took control of territories in Slavic and Finnic-dominated areas of Eastern Europe and annexed Kiev in 882 to serve as the capital of the Kievan Rus. The age of Viking expansion had a long-lasting legacy. From these Viking colonies, connections and settlements, many later communities and groups emerged. From the Normans of Normandy and England, and the Norse Gaels of Scotland and Ireland, to the Rus people and islanders like the Faroese and Icelanders. The ruling groups, as well as the general population of many of these countries, such as the current royal family of Great Britain or the Romanovs of Russia, were descended from these Viking settlers and invaders. During the Viking Age in which Rollo lived, the present-day nations of Norway, Denmark and Sweden did not exist. The general Scandinavian region was loosely united through its similarities in culture and language, but no real geographical distinctions were made. This is one of the reasons why it is difficult to tell exactly where individual Vikings like Rollo were born. Through the Viking period, the Norse homelands were gradually consolidated and larger entities replaced the small, often ill-defined kingdoms. The names of these Scandinavian kings are only reliably known towards the end of the Viking period, and it was only after the Viking Age had come to an end that the separate kingdoms of Norway, Denmark and Sweden gradually acquired distinct identities as nations, a process that occurred at the same time as Christianization. The Christianization of Europe, which had begun under the Roman Empire, was still underway during Rollo's lifetime. The powerhouse behind the Christianization of the Vikings in particular was Frankia, France. France had been united somewhat briefly under Emperor Charlemagne as part of his wider Carolingian Empire before it was divided again between his sons upon his death in 814. During Rollo's time, the Kingdom of West Frankia controlled much of the geographical territory of modern-day France, though the eastern territories of Lorraine, the Kingdom of Burgundy, Alsace and Provence, and also Brittany in the west, remained just outside West Frankia's sphere of influence. After the impressive power and influence of Charlemagne, who had been crowned Emperor of the First Holy Roman Empire by Pope Leo in 800, the authority of the West Frankish monarchs was hugely restricted in comparison. This was partly due to the growing power of their vassals, who ruled over vast fiefdoms. The power vacuum left by weak royal authority meant wars between the fiefs were rampant, as were conflicts between the vassals and the Frankish monarchs themselves. The period was also marked by endless Viking raids and clashes between the West Franks and the Norsemen, which eventually resulted in the creation of Normandy, meaning men of the north, in 911. Viking raids in West Frankia began in 820, especially in the Seine Valley region, and continued regularly until peace was signed between Rollo and King Charles the Simple of West Francia in 911. It is believed that the first Viking raids along the River Seine in northern France occurred around 820. 13 ships reached the Seine Bay, where a force of Vikings landed, but, having to face the unexpected shore guard, were forced to re-embark, leaving 5 of their number dead on the bank of the Seine. In 841, a better prepared Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and captured and burned the city of Rouen on the 14th of May. The Viking in charge of this fleet, Asgeir, continued to plunder down the Seine, bringing home an enormous amount of loot, in particular from the raid on the rich Jumièges monastery on the 24th of May and from the ransom paid on the 28th of May for the freeing of the nearby monastery of Fontenelle and 68 captives. Paris itself was besieged on the 28th of March 845, this time by a fleet led by Viking chieftain Reginurus. This huge 120-ship fleet carried around 6,000 men up the Seine and successfully forced King Charles the Bald of France to pay 7,000 livres, the currency of West Francia at the time, in return for Paris to be spared. But this payment did not bring an end to the Viking raids. In 851, Asgeir and his men were back on the Seine, this time to devastate the monastery of Fontenelle. Once they returned there again, 89 days later, they reportedly found nothing left to plunder, and so burned it down. The next year, Asgeir and his force raided on foot in the area of Flanders from their base in Rouen. In the face of the Frankish army, they had to overwinter on Jeufosse Island, from where they controlled the important entrance to the Seine and the Frankish interior. By 853, new groups of Vikings, mainly Norwegians led by Sigtryg and Godfrid, began sailing up the Seine and establishing their own bases. The Frankish army of Charles the Bald was forced to engage his forces and, where this failed, negotiate with the Vikings. Significant Viking attacks on Paris and on wealthy monasteries in the Seine Valley occurred in 853, 855, 857 and 859. Indeed, by 858, the raids in Frankia had become so lucrative that famous Viking leaders, Bjorn Ironside, allegedly the son of Ragnar Lothbrok and his queen Aslog, and Hastings, also known as Hastings, attacked the region just before or following a famous raiding expedition in the Mediterranean. The year 859 saw a redoubling of Viking efforts when Charles the Bald was distracted by a struggle over territory with his half-brother Louis the German, ruler of East Francia. Taking advantage of the internal turmoil of their enemies, a common Viking tactic used in England as well as in France, the Vikings attacked far from their bases, reaching Bayeux, Léon, and Beauvais, where bishops were executed and monasteries plundered. In the year of 860, the believed year of Rollo's birth, King Charles the Bald gave the order to build fortified bridges across the Seine and Loire rivers to protect Paris and the Frankish heartland against Viking raids. He also hired the services of Wayland, a Viking chieftain based on the Somme, to attack the Seine Vikings. Wayland besieged the Vikings, but accepted a huge bribe of 6,000 pounds of silver to let them escape. In the summer of 860, the Seine Viking chieftains Hastings and Bjorn Ironside ravaged upstream as far as Italy. They sailed up the river Arno to sack the cities of Pisa and Fiesole in Tuscany. At the same time, Viking raiders led by Valand sailed to England and attacked Winchester, the capital of Wessex, and then set it ablaze. Valand and his warriors then moved even further inland before being defeated by West Saxon forces. Back in West Frankia, King Charles the Bald ordered local ruler Robert the Strong of Neustria to attack Valand and his Vikings, who then submitted to Charles and were forced to accept Christianity and be baptized. A tribute called Danegeld was raised as a tax and paid to stop Viking raiding in Neustria. This pattern of military submission, payment and baptism was used throughout Rollo's lifetime in an attempt to control the Vikings in West Francia. But Viking raids in West Francia continued, with some Viking leaders establishing short-lived settlements, though it was not until Rollo and the establishment of Normandy that a permanent Viking settlement was created in France. What Rollo did before the establishment of Normandy is an historical mystery. There is a particularly large gap in the historical record between Rollo's mostly unknown childhood and the first report of him taking up the Viking raiding tradition. The earliest reference to Rollo comes from 876, when 100 ships sailed up the Seine to lay waste to the region, likely led or co-led by Rollo. Norman historian Dudo of Saint-Quentin, who wrote his History of the Normans around 986, stated that Rollo had seized Rouen in 876. This claim is supported by another chronicler, Flodoard, who records that Robert, the ruler of the Breton March buffer between France and the Vikings, waged a campaign against the Vikings which nearly leveled Rouen and other nearby settlements. In the end, several coastal provinces in the region were ceded to Rollo and the Vikings, including Bayeux. Chronicler Dudo recorded that while ruling Bayeux, Rollo carried off the daughter of the Count of Rennes, a beautiful woman named Poppa. Although her parentage is debated, it is possible that she was the daughter of Count Berengar II of Neustria, who was captured by Rollo. It is possible, though, that this claim of Poppa's significant parentage was perhaps invented by Dudo to legitimize the lineage of their son, William I Longsword. Poppa remained the wife mor Danico, a medieval Latin expression meaning according to Danish custom, and as Rollo subsequently married Gisela of France, doubt is cast on the claim that Poppa was from a powerful Christian noble family, as they would have insisted on a legal monogamous marriage. It seems more likely that Poppa was actually of common origin, perhaps taken from a country where Rollo had traded or raided, or from Bayeux itself. Not content with Bayeux and the other coastal provinces won in 876, Rollo continued raiding across the Seine Valley. In the 885 to 886 siege of Paris, it was said that Rollo took part in leading the Viking raiders before they were pushed back by Count Odo of Paris. Then, in 911, a group of Vikings led by Rollo besieged Paris again, and also the city of Chartres, southwest of Paris. A resounding victory at Chartres on the 26th of August forced King Charles the Simple of France to negotiate with Rollo. After consulting with his trusted advisors, Charles acknowledged that the only way to stop the Viking raids, other than the age-old tactic of paying them, known as the Danegeld, was to turn Rollo from enemy into ally. Charles sent the Archbishop of Rouen to Rollo to present him with an offer of land in return for his sworn loyalty to Charles. The land offered, in what is today Normandy, was neglected and, at the time, unprofitable, but Rollo consulted with his Danish chiefs, who encouraged him to see the value in the land that, though currently desolate, had the potential to become more affluent. Rollo decided to accept Charles's proposal. The deal also included the caveat that Rollo should accept a Christian baptism and marry Charles's daughter Gisela. But when the day of the baptism arrived, Rollo refused on the grounds that it would take many years to restore the health and prosperity of the land he had been offered. Again, Charles's councillors encouraged him to make the deal at all costs in order to protect the kingdom of West Frankia. Now, the matter of baptism also weighed into the decision. Converting a Viking pagan leader to Christianity would be an important victory in France's Christianizing mission. Charles first offered Rollo the addition of Flanders, but Rollo declined because the land was too marshy. Then Charles offered Brittany, an independent duchy that West Frankia had failed to conquer, but which bordered the lands already offered to Rollo. And Rollo accepted. The date of Rollo's baptism and marriage to Gisela was now set. Rollo swore loyalty to Charles and ceased raiding against West Frankia in return for his promised lands. The resulting Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte created the Duchy of Normandy. Rollo now controlled all of the land from the river Epte, which lies between Rouen and Paris and westwards to the sea, as well as the independent Duchy of Brittany. The treaty was to be finalized by a pledge of fealty, a display of loyalty and respect on Rollo's part. He was asked to kiss the foot of King Charles as a vassal would his king, but Rollo refused. Chronicler Dudo noted that Rollo declared, "I will never bow my knees at the knees of any man, and no man's foot will I kiss." Instead, at the urging of the Franks, he ordered one of his warriors to kiss the king's foot, which led to, according to Dudo, a humorous scene. The warrior immediately grasped the king's foot and raised it to his mouth to kiss while still standing, which caused Charles to land flat on his back to the delight of the Vikings and the horror of the Franks. After taking his oath of fealty, Rollo proceeded to divide his lands between his chieftains and settled his capital at Rouen. According to the deal, Rollo was baptized in 912, and his conversion to Christianity was held up by later Christian writers as a triumphant moment in Christian history. Rollo's story was embellished and presented as a case study for the victory of Christianity over paganism. If this savage pagan Viking chief could be brought into the light of Christianity, accept Christian virtues, and bring Christian law to the land, then the spread of Christianity into the pagan north was inevitable. But these Christian writers ignored both Rollo's life prior to his interactions with Charles, a problem for anyone in the present trying to understand Rollo's early life, and the fact that he is said to have died a pagan. The question of Rollo's marriage to Gisela is an uncertain one. Chroniclers such as the Norman chronicler William of Jumièges do refer to Rollo having two wives. The captive Poppa, taken at Bayeux, whom Rollo married more Danico, according to Danish custom, and Gisela, his wife more Cristiano, married according to Christian custom. It is believed that Rollo and Gisela married at the time of the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, but given that her father, Charles, had only been married in 907, Gisela was either 4 years old or an illegitimate child. The marriage of Gisela and Rollo is also called into question by the fact there are no records of a royal princess or her marriage in Frankish sources, suggesting that Gisela may be entirely fictional. It is also suspicious that the son of Rollo and Poppa, William Longsword, was recognized as legitimate by Christian Franks and that he became his father's successor. A child resulting from the legal Christian marriage between Rollo and Gisela would have displaced William as a legitimate heir. It is clear that after Gisela died, if she had existed, Rollo returned to his first wife, Poppa. Although the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte had created the new territorial entity of Normandy, the policy behind the agreement was nothing new. In fact, the treaty was simply a continuation of a defence policy used by the Franks against the Vikings for generations. Charles the Simple knew from experience, his own and that of his ancestors, that fighting off the Viking raiders was a fruitless strategy. In the past, only paying off the Viking raiders with Danegeld had proved anything like a positive solution for West Frankia. Appeasement was the only viable path open to Charles. The main difference between the earlier payoffs and the Treaty of 911 was Rollo himself. Previous Viking leaders had preferred to pillage the land and leave in a short time frame. Rollo took the treaty seriously, honoured his promise of loyalty to the king, and stayed in Normandy to protect the people he had sworn to protect. Equally, his promise to end Viking raids in the region seems to have been fulfilled. There are no records of Viking raids in West Francia after 911. Rollo quickly took up the mantle of leadership in Normandy and set upon a policy of restoration and reformation. He imposed law and order, promoted peace, and established privileges. He restored churches that had been devastated by Viking raids and rebuilt city walls and defences. The lands he had been given were restored, and Normandy was to thrive as a result. Rollo ruled not as a Frankish vassal, but as a Viking chief. He established a law code that resembled those in Scandinavia at the time. In particular, he worked to reform passive laws which suggested, rather than enforced, acceptable behaviours and morals. His new law code emphasised responsibility and personal honour. Punishments became more severe, including the use of the death penalty for crimes such as theft, murder, assault, and fraud. A particular tale of fraud and the justice levelled out according to Rollo's law code highlights the changes that he made. It was said that a farmer's wife tried to take advantage of a law change which required farm tools to be left in the field overnight by hiding them and claiming they had been robbed. Rollo reimbursed the man for the loss of his tools and called for trials by ordeal for the suspects of the theft. After no culprit was found, the wife was beaten until she confessed to the fraud, and when her husband admitted he had known about the fraud all along, both she and her husband were found guilty and hanged. The event was said to have terrified the local inhabitants to such an extent that Normandy became a territory free from petty criminality for the next century. Harsh punishments were also handed out to anyone who was guilty of dishonouring Rollo's reputation or that of his wife. The punishment for such a crime was execution in Roan's public square. Cases of false witness or anything that wasted the time of those working in the justice system were hugely reduced. These examples of Viking justice seemed harsh to the Christian bishops of the region, but it was argued that Rollo's conversion and the conversion of all pagans was a process which would take time. The mixture of Viking and Christian traditions and culture, views of law and order and of morality was to be expected for a period of time. In any case, no bishop could argue against Rollo's record of success in Normandy. His maintenance of law and order and the prosperity he had brought to the region were undeniable. Rollo's reign over Normandy was a success. Though later chronicles often referred to Rollo as the first Duke of Normandy, he never actually held this title. His great-grandson, Richard II, was the real first Duke of Normandy. Later historians have sometimes given Rollo the title of Count, but he was never awarded this title either. Earlier historians and chroniclers called him Chieftain Rollo, but whatever title he claimed for himself is unknown. While he lived, Rollo would have simply been called Rollo. Rollo honoured the agreement made with Charles the Simple and also exerted control over the Seine Vikings in order to maintain the peace. But this changed in 922 when Charles was deposed. Charles's successor, Robert I, could not count on Rollo's loyalty. Rollo argued that his pledge of loyalty and allegiance was sworn to Charles, not to his successors, and especially not to Robert, who Rollo saw as a usurper. Instead, Rollo remained loyal to Charles and opposed Robert I's reign. Declaring the agreement now void, Rollo took up raiding once again, this time in a bid to expand his territory westwards and pressure other rulers to negotiate to his benefit. The pressure proved effective. An agreement was made between Robert I and a group of Norsemen thought to be led by Rollo, which handed over the provinces of Bessin, a northern region in present-day Normandy and Maine, a province south of Normandy. The westward movement of Rollo's authority saw other settled Vikings fall under his influence, which had perhaps been King Robert's intent. Robert's motives behind this additional land grant have been lost to history, but the move has been painted equally as a method of appeasement to stop Rollo seizing more land, an attempt to restrain and Christianize other Vikings in the region, and as a way of defending the Franks near Bayeux against other nearby Viking groups. After this reference to the expansion of his territory between 922 and Robert I's death in 923, Rollo again disappears from history. Rollo retired from ruling Normandy in 927 and was succeeded by his son William Longsword, 927 to 942. It is likely that Rollo died shortly after, around 930. The final brief mention of Rollo in the early chronicles comes in 928 by chronicler Fleudoir, and in 933 it is noted that his son, William, inherited a third grant of land which stretched from the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy southwards to Rennes in East Brittany. Rollo's immediate successors, William Longsword, his successor and illegitimate son Richard I, also known as Richard the Fearless, and Richard's successor Richard II, continued to rule Normandy in the way of their ancestor Rollo, honouring his policies which had brought Normandy prosperity, order, and peace. Over time, Normandy was transformed from a neglected backwater into a formidable duchy. The hierarchy and system of law and order in Normandy developed in accordance with developments in France as a whole, but retained a distinct individuality. The law code in Normandy emerged first as ancient customary law and was transcribed in Latin in the early 13th century. Sometime between 1235 and 1245, William the Conqueror, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, had Normandy's law code rewritten, becoming the second Grand Coutumier de Normandie, the customary law code of Normandy. The earlier custom law represented a combination of Scandinavian legal principles and Frankish law. William the Conqueror's adaptations saw Normandy's law code develop into an amalgamation of royal legislation, Roman law, medieval Frankish law, and canon law. The Coutume de Normandie was still in force in the Channel Islands until the French Revolution in 1789. It finally ceased to be used in France in 1804, when Napoleon's civil code unified the laws and customs of the French provinces under national law. Rollo's descendants adopted the feudal system in Normandy, as in the rest of France and in England after the Norman conquest. The feudal system codified a regimented social and political system. In this system, rights and obligations were enshrined and the boundaries between social classes were strengthened. The peasants were attached to the land in serfdom. Land ownership was the right of the upper classes. This was a manorial system in which the peasants worked, the upper classes defended the country, and the king ruled. Under feudalism, the Duke of Normandy paid homage to the King of France as a vassal in return for the land of Normandy. But Normandy, like many other regions within medieval France, retained both its independence and its distinct culture. Prior to Rollo's arrival in Normandy, the people living there were mostly indistinct from those in other regions of France, such as Picardy or Ile-de-France. the distinct identity of Normandy and the Normans developed under Rollo's descendants. William Longsword and Richard the Fearless began assimilating their maternal French Catholic culture with that of their Viking ancestors, becoming known as the Normans of Normandy. As Vikings had done for generations, the Normans married indigenous women to legitimize their claims to land won by conquest and took up Christianity and the native language, resulting in a bilingual society. Norman elites would talk amongst themselves in French, but converse with others and their foreign wives in English, Italian, Spanish, or Greek. This resulted in increasing assimilation, meaning that while the second generation of Normans was bilingual, the third was monolingual. The language spoken in Normandy became known as Norman French, a mix of Norse and indigenous Gallo-Franks. The Normans did not restrict themselves to Normandy. Diplomatic connections were sought after, and many young Normans left Normandy to try their luck in foreign climes and find foreign brides. Even Rollo's daughters were married off to important foreign elites. Rollo's daughter with his first wife Poppa, Gerloch, also known as Adele or Adela, was married to William III, Count of Poitou, and the future Duke of Aquitaine. Another of Rollo's daughters, Cadlinar, who had been born in Scotland, most likely to a Scottish mother, married an Irish prince named Bearlan mac Ciamach, later King of South Brega, which is north of Dublin. Over the 2 centuries following Rollo's death, his descendants came to the thrones of England, Ireland, Sicily, and Antioch, leaving a lasting legacy on the histories of Europe and the Near East. The Viking and Norman impact on England was particularly significant. The last Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, had Danish ancestors, and 2 Vikings even directly ascended the English throne: Sweyn Forkbeard from 1013 until 1014, and his son Canute from 1016 to 1035. But it was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William the Conqueror, who most transformed England and its monarchy after the Norman conquest of 1066. William came to the throne after King Edward the Confessor's death by defeating 2 other claimants to the English throne, Anglo-Saxon Harold Godwinson and the Viking Harold Hardrada. But William did have a claim to the throne based on blood. William's great-aunt, Emma, had been King Edward the Confessor's mother. The success of the Norman conquest of England was rooted in William's military cunning, a skill passed down to him from his marauding Viking ancestors. Upon arriving on the English coast, William built a fortification, a strategy the Normans had developed in France, pillaged the coastline, and lured Harold Godwinson south. William's tactical brilliance and Viking ruthlessness led him to victory over Godwinson, and England was then ruled by the Duke of Normandy. When installed on the throne of England, William continued to utilize the lessons from his Norman heritage. He continued the family tradition of marrying relatives of his rivals to secure their loyalty and cooperated with many of the existing bishops. He also built huge castles and fortifications, as was popular in his French homeland, including the White Tower or Tower of London. William's castles spread across the breadth of England and as far north as York, highlighting Norman power and permanence. Besides the landscape altered by William's castle-building projects, Norman rule in England also left a lasting legacy on English law, land ownership, and system of government. William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book surveyed land ownership and found that the Church held 26% of the land, and the rest now lay almost entirely in Norman hands. The old Anglo-Saxon elite were replaced over time, and only around 5% of the land belonged to natives. The language of the court and government was now French. As in Normandy, the feudal system was formalized and social classes solidified. the magnates with titles and territory given by the king were invited to attend royal councils, forming the pre-runner of the House of Lords, while untitled local landowners continued to run local affairs. The Normans also left their mark upon the history of English royalty. William the Conqueror's granddaughter Matilda briefly reigned during a civil war from 1141 to 1148, and her son, Henry Plantagenet, became King Henry II in 1172. The current British royal family are direct descendants of the House of Plantagenet, and therefore the House of Normandy. Another line of the House of Normandy, the Hauteville line, conquered Sicily in 1091. The Vikings had long been involved in the region of Italy. As early as 860, there are reports of Frankia-based Vikings reaching Iberia and what is now Italy. Chronicler Dudo reported that Vikings used the river Arno to sack the port city of Luni in northwest Italy, Pisa, and Fiesole north of Florence. Viking mercenaries working for Byzantium, the Varangians, and Viking traders would have crossed the land of Italy many times. In 965, Arab Muslims had seized Sicily from the Byzantine Empire, and succession crises and conflict between regional powers in the early 11th century left a vacuum for the Normans to fill. Norman Robert Guiscard, then Duke of Apulia and Calabria, was given the title of Duke of Sicily by the Pope, who wanted Robert and his brother Roger Bosso to seize the island and revert it to its Christian state. In May 1061, the Norman brothers invaded and built the first Norman castle in Sicily, San Marco d'Alonzio in Messina. Continuing to learn from the regions and cultures they conquered, the Normans in southern Italy combined Lombard, northern Italy, Byzantine and Islamic building techniques to form the Norman Arab architecture found in the fortifications in the Kingdom of Sicily. The assault on Sicily continued for another 10 years until a siege on Palermo saw the city fall to the Normans on the 10th of January 1071. Robert, Duke of Sicily, awarded his brother the title of Count of Sicily and partitioned the island with the aim for Roger to take his portion by seizing the remaining Arab-held land. By February 1091, Roger had finally conquered the entirety of Sicily and went on to conquer the island of Malta too. Latin Christianity returned to the island of Sicily, and Palermo became the capital city. The Kingdom of Sicily fell in 1194 when Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI invaded, reportedly on behalf of his wife Constance, the daughter of Roger. But Norman influence in Sicily was not ended in 1194, as Constance's son, a half-Norman, was crowned King Frederick II of Sicily in 1198 and went on to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1212, expanding the influence of the House of Normandy even further. Around the time of the conquering of Sicily, the Principality of Antioch, near present-day Antakya in Turkey, was established around 1098. This was the time of the First Crusade, 1096 to 1099, a religious war in the Holy Land in which many Normans served. Many crusaders who settled in Antioch were of Norman descent, most from the Kingdom of Sicily. A siege of Antioch in October 1097 had been led by the son of Robert, Duke of Apulia, Calabria and Sicily, Bohemond of Taranto. Legends of huge suffering during this winter battle of attrition built up, including tales of crusaders being forced to eat the bodies of the fallen to survive. After Bohemond emerged victorious against the Muslim army, he became the Prince of Antioch, adding to his title of Prince of Taranto in Italy. Bohemond then faced a run of bad luck, including being captured in battle, losing land to the Byzantine Empire, and Antioch being reduced to the status of a vassal of the Byzantine Empire. But the rulership of Antioch continued to be passed down the Norman line from Bohemond to his nephew Tancred, and then to Tancred's son, Bohemond II, before Antioch became a tributary state of the Mongol Empire in 1260. Back in France, Rollo's descendants survived the turmoil of the period through a mix of old Viking strategies, ruthless military action, and the cunning ability to sense weakness in the enemy. The Normans were masters at taking advantage of the infighting among the Frankish aristocracy, a weakness which had left them unable to combat the Rouen Vikings' growing determination to stay. In 987, the House of Normandy had helped appoint King Hugh Capet of the Capetian dynasty to the French throne. The Capetian dynasty lasted until 1792, with its direct descendants ruling France across all periods except the Bonaparte empires. The relationship between Richard I of Normandy, Rollo's grandson, and King Hugh Capet was similar to that between Rollo and King Charles the Simple. Richard gave Hugh his loyalty and supported him with military aid. Equally, Richard II of Normandy shared a deep religious conviction with King Robert II of France and also provided him with military aid against the Duchy of Burgundy. The Dukes of Normandy regularly married their daughters and sisters into the French royal family and to neighbouring noblemen. Rollo's strategy of agreeing to overlordship by the Frankish king became more difficult for his descendants. The Dukes of Normandy swore loyalty to the Frankish king, but in practice ruled over their territory in their own way, as Rollo had done. But after 1066, the elevation of the House of Normandy from duke to king, although it was of another country, made the relationship with the French crown harder to maintain. As king, William and his descendants no longer owed allegiance to the King of France. The House of Normandy became increasingly powerful under William's successors, going on to rule over not only England, Ireland, and Normandy, but also the Channel Islands, Gascony, and Aquitaine. Rollo's descendants continued to rule Normandy until 1204, when the duchy was lost by John Lackland to the French king Philip Augustus. The title of Duke of Normandy was then seized by the Capetian kings and bestowed upon their own relations, as the king could no longer trust the House of Normandy. The administration of the duchy was taken over, and the powerful fortress Château de Rouen was built to ensure compliance. An attempt by King Henry V, a descendant of John Lackland, to reconquer Normandy brought the region temporarily back under the control of Rollo's direct line, but the region was lost again during the reign of his son, King Henry VI. Norman law did continue to be used in Normandy, especially when the barons and towns of Normandy forced the King of France to sign the Norman Charter in 1315, which aimed to reduce the encroachment of royal power, restricted the king's power to create taxes there, and made the judgments of Normandy's main court final, though the charter was broken several times as the French monarchy became more powerful. Rollo himself would not have envisioned the long life Normandy would live under the rule of his direct line, as the Vikings were more often temporary settlers. But his role in the founding of the duchy became more significant the longer the Normans controlled Normandy and expanded their reach to England. The early chroniclers, like Dudo of Saint-Quentin and William of Jumièges, were keen to present Rollo as the sole founder of the great dynasty of the Normans. Dudo of Saint-Quentin, a Frank who developed a positive working relationship with the new rulers of Normandy and became their historian, chronicled the lives of Norman leaders in a level of detail that had been previously reserved for only bishops and abbots. He wrote between 995 and 1015 with the intention of glorifying the early Norman leaders, including Rollo. His work was then built upon by Norman monk William of Jumièges, who wrote after the Norman conquest of England in 1066 with even more determination to celebrate the Norman dukes. Dudo and William of Jumièges shaped the history of the Normans, often focusing on their transformation from pagan Viking raiders to Christian conquerors and leaders. Dudo's narrative that Rollo had almost solely conquered what was to become Normandy was somewhat replaced by William of Jumièges' incorporation of the roles of other significant Vikings, such as Bjorn Ironside and the Danes in general. But Rollo ultimately emerged as the central hero in the story of the dynasty. Later writers have almost always relied on the works of Dudo and William of Jumièges, solidifying their views and interpretations into history. As with many great Vikings, the real Rollo was overshadowed by the legend that grew up around him. Just as Rollo has become more myth than man, the Vikings themselves have been misremembered. Modern interpretations of the Vikings almost always focus on their military prowess and barbarity, to the neglect of the achievements of the Viking culture, trade, and exploration. Popular conceptions of the Vikings ignore the poetic language of Old Norse, the runic inscriptions, the intricacies of the Old Norse religion, and the works of brilliant Viking poets and historians. The Vikings had their own distinctive law code and conceptions of morality, distinctive art and architecture. Unlike modern depictions, most Vikings were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen and traders, not bloodthirsty raiders. The advanced and culturally mixed Viking society shown to us by archaeology and historical sources has been flattened out in favor of the image of savage Viking warriors wearing horned helmets, which the Vikings never wore. Where the Old Norse religion is concerned, interpretations have focused either on the violent aspects of the religion, such as the wars among the gods, or upon the replacement of paganism with Christianity. The 18th and 19th centuries in particular saw a more romanticized picture emerge, with the Vikings presented as noble savages saved by their conversion to Christianity. Today, the only moments of Viking history widely remembered and depicted relate to conquest and raiding. British schools, as a rule, teach the events of the Norman conquest of 1066, in which the brutality of Norman William the Conqueror is highlighted. TV series focus on warfare and family feuds. Rollo receives coverage in Vikings, the TV show, when the much fictionalized story of the formation and defense of Normandy is told. But, as with the chroniclers who focused almost entirely on his transactions with Charles the Simple, anything of Rollo's earlier life is left out. The debates about Rollo's parentage, birthplace, and early life are perhaps not questions we need answering in order to understand Rollo and his legacy. The legacy and myths that grew up around Rollo, and to some extent obscure him as a person, may have been exaggerated to bolster the lineage and claims of his descendants, but his legacy, embellished or not, is what is important about the man. That a Viking of uncertain heritage could demand such a concession of land from a Frankish king, and then make such a permanent success of this settlement, is astonishing. Perhaps evaluating his success in Normandy, still named the Land of the Northmen, and that of his successors, makes up for the large historical gaps in his life story. What do you think of Rollo of Normandy? Was he merely a bloodthirsty Viking, or was he an enterprising founder of a dynasty that was to shape much of medieval Europe? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.